Hello, and welcome to this recorded webinar about the new Art of Headship in association with the Independent Schools portal. My name is Russell Speirs, and I'm the founder and chairman of RSAcademics. We work with schools in the UK and all around the world. In fact, I'm recording this from my hotel in Dubai right now. We work with schools in lots of different ways, marketing and business strategy and student recruitment. We help with governance and fundraising. And of course, we help with leadership, which is the topic for today's webinar. The new Art of Headship, our report, which I'll be talking you through, is intrinsically related to all of those areas, whether it's business strategy, governance, marketing, but obviously it sits most squarely in that last bracket of school leadership. Before I tell you about our new study into the changing nature of headship, I'd like to thank Alicia and the rest of the team at the Independent Schools portal for this opportunity to speak on the topic. And I'd like to thank you for downloading or watching this recording. If you're a head or a deputy, either in the UK or overseas, or if you're a school governor, then there is a lot that is relevant in what I'm about to say. And if you are ahead, then I would encourage you to download this report and share it with your governing body. It's very important that governors are aware of the changing nature of headship and what it means for them. If you have already downloaded the report from our website, then thank you. If you haven't, you can download it for free from the Ideas and Insights section of the RSAcademics website. The full report runs to over 120 pages, but you can always download the summary, which is just about 6 pages, I think. There's even a wall poster. So if you've got a very short attention span or you want to decorate the wall of your office, there is an A3 wall poster where everything is condensed down to a single piece of paper. So however you access it, I do hope that you'll take time to download the report. And do get back in touch with me if you've got any questions. So we published our report entitled The New Art of Headship in September 2023, and it is the result of research that we undertook between January and June of this year, of 2023. Some of you may remember our first report about what it takes to be a successful head, which we published in 2013, so that's 10 years ago, and we called that The Art of Headship. 10 years on, recognizing that so much had changed in the independent school sector, we thought we should see how the role of the head had evolved. And so the aims of our report were to look at how the head's role has changed, what has changed in the environment and the context in which heads work, what are the additional or greater challenges, and what might be the new emphasis of the role or the new priorities in terms of how they spend their time. And then we wanted to look at the implications of all of that, assuming, as we did at the start of the research, that the role of the head had indeed changed in significant ways. What were the new skills that would be required today and in the future? What kind of support and training and indeed different forms of leadership development would heads need? And what might this mean in terms of new approaches to the selection and recruitment of heads? It's important to emphasize that we're not trying to describe in this report in 2023 everything that a head needs to do. What we're looking at is what has changed. Okay, so this report, this latest piece of research, is not about how to be a head of a school. It's about how the role of head has changed in recent years. So how did we go about researching this? Well, I'll talk you through the steps briefly. So we started with in-depth research among 15 experienced heads, including all of those heads who took part in the 2013 study who were still in post or still at the head of a school. So these were long-serving heads, and we sent them a questionnaire with, I think it's about 30 different questions, and they could answer whichever ones they wanted. And it was a sort of open comments type of questionnaire. And then we followed up and interviewed them for up to an hour I think in some cases slightly more, probing what they'd said, making sure we'd understood the nuances of their comments. We then wrote that up and sent a summary of the key findings and insights from that to 24 people who attended 4 different focus groups, mainly heads, again, but also some chairs of governors, a couple of professional coaches who work in the independent school sector, and also representatives from each of the schools associations, so GSA, HMC, IAPS, ISA, and the Society of Heads. That enabled us to list a number of different factors which we could then test in a larger study, a quantitative study, and just over 100 people replied to that anonymous survey. They were picked completely at random, alphabetically. We wanted to check whether the findings from the qualitative research phase were valid, were true. We wanted to ask how important they were, and also other questions like, for example, which of these various things had changed the most, or when it comes to the skills that heads needed, the 16 skills that we'd identified from the earlier phases of the research, which of these did the heads feel they were best at or indeed least good at? And of course, because it's a quantitative study and people were picked at random, we could, in a lot of cases, compare answers between heads of different types of schools. And then we obtained 18 different case studies from heads, but also from consultants and advisors and other practitioners in the sector. And these were mostly people sharing their own personal experience or sharing examples of good practice. And I'll refer to a couple of those a bit later. We're very grateful to everybody that's helped with this research, the people that gave up an enormous amount of time in most cases. And we were also struck by just how interested everybody seemed to be in the topic. So we do think that this research really strikes a chord, a topical chord, if I could put it like that. So in this webinar, I'm going to be presenting just the key findings, very much like I set out a moment ago when referring to the aims of the research. We'll look first at the changing nature of headship, and in particular, the challenges that heads identified. And then we'll look at what this means in terms of the skills they need, how heads should be supported or could be supported these days, and how we might want to take a different approach to the selection and appointment of heads who will be leading the schools in the future. The second part of our research is full of practical advice and helpful insights, actually. But the first part does tend to focus a little bit on the negatives. It does tend to focus on the challenges and the difficulties. We think this is perhaps a natural tendency, or perhaps it's a natural tendency amongst school heads, I don't know. But it's perhaps natural that when we ask them what has changed, they have tended to dwell on the difficulties that have become greater in recent times. But I think it's very important that I should tell you just how positive people were also about the role. We had people saying things like this: it remains the best job in the world, but you need to be very clear about what motivates you and want to do it in order for it to be enjoyable and sustainable. Another person said, I think one aspect to emphasize is that it is still a great job, and there is a need to recognize that much stays the same. It is still great fun being ahead, and it's a privilege too. So I won't keep re-quoting those people and the others who said similar things, but I wouldn't want this to come across as too negative, really, in what I'm about to say. So let's first of all look at the changing context, the way the environment has evolved and impacted on the nature of school leadership. And I should say, I won't keep repeating it, but this study is based on the views from heads and others in the independent sector in the UK. But if you are watching this webinar from the state sector or from the international school sector, there is much that I think will be relevant. So in terms of the context, the changing context, there are two things to say here first. One is that stakeholders' expectations have changed, and what I really mean by that is increased. So, for example, so society itself, this is the words of one of our interviewees, Society itself has drastically changed. Heads manage a range of stakeholders, and it seems that all stakeholders' expectations have changed, from parents and staff to the independent schools inspectorate, to partnership partners, to unions, to pupils, to alumni. So the change is compounded by the many different people who impact on our role. We'll come back to that, of course, in a moment. The second thing to say is about the changing context relates to COVID. People talked very much about a period before COVID and after COVID in their headship. 2020 was clearly a unique and very significant turning point in terms of their role as heads. Before COVID, let me tell you how one person described headship. Before COVID, headship was easier. I was focused on the education of students and improving that provision. Aspects that seemed challenging or put the leadership team in crisis mode were all relatively minor compared to the challenges presented since March 2020. So before COVID, there was much more of an internal focus, much more of a focus on improving what was already there. These were some of the things that people said were uppermost on their agenda. And then came the pandemic in 2020. There was obviously a huge upheaval in society in general. There was a complete change in our relationship with technology and indeed our relationship with each other and with our communities and with our families and our employers. Companies and schools faced financial losses and insecurity, and a lot of us were impacted in terms of our own personal well-being. And then just as we were emerging from that, the cost of living crisis came to the fore. There were increased political threats in terms of tax regimes for independent schools and more financial pressures. And the cumulative effect of all this has been massive. So now heads are having to deal with much more uncertainty. They're dealing much more with unpredictability, greater external threats, and indeed the possibility of very significant changes to their school business. So the time before COVID, according to many of the heads we spoke to, really does feel like, as one person said, a different era. So that's just a little bit on the changing context. And of course, in the report, the full report, we go into all of these topics that I'm going to be covering in much more detail. And indeed, we'll be going in the report, we go into a lot of topics that I won't have time to cover at all today. But let's look now at how these changes in the context have impacted on headship. And specifically, let's consider the new or greater challenges that heads now face before. We've identified 9 particularly important challenges, which are either new to heads these days, or in almost all cases, not new, but they're experienced much more acutely. So that's why we refer to these new or greater challenges than before. So I'll just skip through them and then we'll pick up on 3 or 4 of them in a bit more detail. So the financial pressures that heads now have to deal with, changing parent expectations, HR issues, and increasingly demanding staff who are more and more aware of their employment rights and less willing to give up what they might nowadays call personal time. Student mental health, which we'll look at briefly in a second. And then this very important topic, which we've referred to in different ways. Here I'm calling it achieving equality, diversity, and inclusion, but it also relates to some of the what we've called societal changes to do with inclusion and indeed gender identity and personal identity, which heads are expected to navigate. Many of them thought that this was a very difficult path for them to tread and to know what was the right thing to do. Leading and communicating in the age of social media, the fact that heads are always in the spotlight and things spiral very quickly thanks to things like WhatsApp and so on. The increased regulatory environment in which heads have to lead their schools. The greater external focus for heads. Many heads are spending much more time out of school than they ever did before for various reasons. And then, of course, technology and AI. And I will just say on that last topic, that I'm going to be one of the only people running a webinar that's not going to be dwelling on it. And that's really because it didn't emerge strongly from our research as a significant challenge that heads were facing. That might be because of the timing, or it might be for a number of different reasons. We don't know. But when we realized that hardly anyone had spoken about it in the qualitative phases, those 2 early phases of our research, we thought nonetheless we should put it into the questionnaire. We should at least test whether or not this is a widespread challenge for heads and a widespread change that they felt was important. And it didn't really emerge. So we won't be looking at that too much. There are plenty of other challenges that heads have got, so we don't need to necessarily add another one. So as I said before, we were very lucky to have been helped in our research by 104 serving heads of schools. So we can find out which of the challenges we identified are most felt most widely, which aspects of headship have changed the most, which of the new challenges heads felt was the most difficult to deal with, or indeed the most time consuming. So first of all, we asked which of the 13 challenges that we'd identified from the initial research had changed the most. And we said that heads could pick up to 7, which they felt had changed the most. So I'll just show you the results of that particular question. I wouldn't draw too much of a distinction between the one that comes top and the one that comes second, or indeed the one that comes third and the one that comes fourth. But I think we can say that the ones that are at the top of the graph are more important than the ones at the bottom. So supporting student mental health and navigating societal changes such as equality and gender issues, changing staff expectations and dealing with contentious HR issues, responding to unprecedented financial pressures, and responding to changing parent expectations and dealing with contentious issues raised by parents. So those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are probably the most noteworthy of the different, the new challenges or the greater challenges which heads are experiencing. And then we asked of the ones they've just selected, of the up to 7 items that they've selected, which single aspect has changed the most? And you can see, again, not much difference, but mental health, gender identity, and societal changes relating to diversity and inclusion, parents' expectations, and the financial pressures, they emerge most strongly there. I think we can agree that. And then finally, there were other questions that we put to them, but just for now, the only other thing I want to show you is the answer to the question, of these, which do you think is the single most challenging change in your role? And very clearly, responding to unprecedented financial pressures emerged as the most challenging of the changes to headship. So depending on which exact question we asked, there are probably 5, as I say, sort of new or greater challenges which are most worthy of note. And we'll be looking at a few of those now. In the report, in the full report, we cover all 9. We don't look at beyond that. We don't look at the other 4 that didn't really get much traction in the quantitative study. So the most challenging of the changes we have called responding to unprecedented financial pressures. Obviously, there's nothing new about responding to financial pressures. Those have always been there for any business leader and any school leader in the independent sector, probably in any sector. But what we found from our research is that these pressures of a much more sort of existential nature now. And this was particularly the case in smaller schools. So heads of smaller schools were much more likely to say that this was the most challenging change to their headship, as were the heads of boarding schools and the heads of schools that were not in a group. We're not talking there about a commercially owned group. We're not making any distinction between a commercially owned or investor-funded group and a not-for-profit group. Just being in a group made you less likely to say that the financial pressures were the most significant challenge. So as I said, this is to do with the recovery from COVID, increased costs, future threats, increased pay expectations from staff, and so on. And here are just a few comments while I discreetly slurp my coffee, if I may. I'll just let you look at those comments. So I'm not sure if you're meant to do that on a webinar recording, but anyway, it's done now. I'm not going to edit that. Okay, so let's look at the next significant change in the nature of headship in recent years. And managing parent expectations and behaviour is actually the aspect of headship which has changed, which takes up the most time. So of those 9 significant challenges, this is the one that heads said takes up the most of their time. And heads in London and the Southeast, and also heads of prep schools or junior schools were most likely to raise this as a particular challenge. So here we're talking about a small but increased number of parents who are more likely. So it's slightly more parents, and there's a sense that all parents are more likely to make what some people might call unreasonable demands. You could say the customer is always right, but based on some of the stories that we were told, I think that aphorism might come under some challenge. We're talking about formal complaints, even litigation in some cases, and this has a huge impact on heads and governors and senior staff, and takes up a disproportionate amount of time. A lot of this stems from increased parental anxiety, and which in turn sort of leads to them wanting to be more involved in decisions affecting their child at school. Here are just a few of the things that Head said. My number one prediction for the future is more litigious parents. I can see a situation where all schools will have a permanent legal advisor full-time on the staff. There may be a kernel of truth in what the parents are complaining about, but often it is a study of obsession from parents who become entrenched. And in our report, in the case studies, we look at some proactive measures one particular case study from a girls' boarding school relates how they have introduced some proactive measures to induct parents better, let's say, or more fully in the values of the school and in the type of relationship that the school is looking for with its parents. And the case study also touches on some of the ways in which they're looking to improve two-way communication to stop things from escalating. This third area, they're not, as I say, particularly ranked in any order because it depends on which question you ask. But this was seen as the area which has changed the most, as you may remember from an earlier slide. And this is true particularly in relation to heads of senior schools and heads of boarding schools. So heads of senior schools and heads of boarding schools are more likely to recognise this as a greater challenge. It's obviously a much bigger issue. Since COVID, you don't need me to tell you that. But the lack of local support from government-funded services and the NHS has made schools even more on the front line of dealing with some quite difficult mental health challenges. And heads are often, not just heads, of course, other staff, whether it's pastoral leaders or senior members of the team, are often dealing now with, or more likely to be dealing now with, highly complex situations and very sensitive issues. And heads talk to us about the need for additional resources to boost the level of support that they can provide, to provide additional counselling services, for example, and training for staff, and also additional time spent with children, teaching them about well-being. Back in 2015, I've just remembered that we published a report called 10 Trends, and in back then we had one of the chapters was called well-being coming to the top of the agenda, and it certainly has come to the top of the agenda for many heads. I know we all have rose-tinted views of the past, but I honestly feel this issue is completely different to when I started, said one head. The second one there says, as a head, you often feel you have to make decisions that really should be decided on by a mental health professional. Um, and the last one, mental health as a reason for behaviors is used now, and the resulting exceptionalism needs careful managing. And that's, I suppose, alluding to the kind of very sensitive and complex situation which heads are required to assess and make decisions on. Very similar, some of those comments I've just made. This expectation of heads to navigate a path through difficult, sensitive, and highly nuanced and personal complexities would be true of this next topic: achieving equality, diversity, and inclusion, and navigating related societal changes. Some heads found that the changes that have happened, particularly in the last sort of 3 to 5 years, relating to or being brought to attention by movements such as Black Lives Matter or Everyone's Invited. Several heads referred to this being challenging, refreshing, and energizing. They saw this very much as a change for the good. But others found themselves, particularly when it came to gender identity, in fact, probably only in relation to gender identity, they found themselves in what they called, or one person called, an ideological battleground. Just a few comments here from the heads. We are the go-to people on a whole range of societal issues. It has become a kind of moral burden, and we are expected to be experts on things we are probably not expert on. So that's really what I was referring to just now. But as I say, there's a lot of very positive things about this as well. But heads, I think, feel a little bit out of their depth sometimes, and very much sort of almost in a situation where they know they're not going to get it right for everybody. So the changing nature of headship, we're going to look now at the implications, but this slide is just to remind you of the 4 areas that I've touched on, but also of the several other areas that we don't have time for in this particular presentation. I've just sort of skimmed the surface, really. But perhaps take a moment now to think, which of these do you find most difficult? And how could you ensure that you have the support you need in those areas which you find most difficult? As I say, I'll just take a moment to think, which of these areas do you find most difficult, most challenging, and how might you get further support or help or advice so that you don't feel quite so vulnerable in those particular areas. I'll just give you a moment to think on that while I finish off my coffee, which is quite cold now. Okay, so that question that I just put to you is indeed one of the questions that we try and answer in our research about how heads can get that extra support that they need. And indeed, the second part of our report is very much, what does all this mean? What are the implications? What some people call the so what. And it's divided into 3 areas. I'll just tell you what those 3 areas are, and then we'll go through each of them in a bit more detail. So the first is the skills and knowledge which heads increasingly need. The second area is what kind of support and development training do heads need today. And then, as I said earlier, the last one is about the appointment of heads. How should boards of governors, boards of directors, how should they go about assessing candidates for headship and choosing the best head for their school? So let's look first at the skills, and I'm going to just talk you through an example of how certain skills are required to meet the new challenges, and this gives you an insight into the kind of the nature of the conversation. We've already spoken a little bit about the need for heads to respond to the increased financial pressures. So we'll just use that example again to illustrate how our conversations went. So the starting point is that most schools, almost all independent schools, face increased financial pressures. And then there is therefore an obligation on the head to develop and implement a strategy. And I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent here, but by develop and implement, we mean lead. Okay, so lead the thinking and lead the realization, the enactment of the strategy, so the implementation, to steer the school through those increased financial stormy waters. So if that's what they need to do, well, then what are the skills that heads need to lead the strategic response to those financial pressures? What do they need to be good at in order to do that successfully? Because obviously that is going to test a number of different skills. So here are the skills that we've identified in our research and that we cover in our report that are required for that to meet that particular challenge. So the first, obviously, is greater business and financial acumen, a better understanding, intuitive or technical, of the workings of a company and the financial metrics and levers and triggers that financial success requires or impacts on. In many cases, school leaders are going to need to be more creative and courageous with the strategic response. As I pointed out before, post-COVID, we're dealing with unpredictability and uncertainty. We're not just dealing with improving what we've already got. And so this is going to require, in many cases, more bold and innovative strategic solutions. This is a particularly interesting area, we think, both for heads and for the leadership teams in which heads work. There is a greater requirement than ever before for heads to delegate and to develop their senior leadership team. And what we mean by develop is not just make sure you've got the right people in the right jobs, but of course that's probably the starting point, but also to empower them and to free them up, excuse me, to make decisions. And so in our report, we have actually a case study from our own coaching partner, which is a company called Love Your Coaching, led by Charlie Warshawski. And in that case study, Charlie talks about coaching skills that heads can develop in order to empower their leadership team and free up time for the heads to do all the other things they've got to do, including lead strategically. If you're going to see your school through these difficult times, you need to have a really highly effective working relationship with the governing body, because that will certainly be put to the test. You're going to have to make some very difficult decisions, and that needs to be done in a constructive and collaborative way. There's more to be said about governance and the changes in governance a little bit later, but we'll just that's enough on that topic for now. Clearly, for example, if we just take as an example the imposition of VAT on school fees, that's going to require a response, several responses and changes. But that's just one example of the things that heads are needing to grapple with. And so greater change management skills will be required in order to lead the strategy. And then finally, not financially, slip of the tongue. Finally, while all this is going on, and as heads are considering and analysing very difficult scenarios, let's say, they need to provide reassurance to their school community, and that can put a great strain on the heads themselves. The balance between their own well-being and inner sort of peace of mind, and at the same time, the fact that they know that they're making some very difficult decisions. They need to appear strong and reassuring, and be the kind of leader that the community wants them to be. So as I say, that's quite a difficult balancing act for heads. So we would include resilience, personal resilience, as one of the additional skills that heads need. So you might want to just pause this recording here and just ask yourself, which of these skills would you say are the most important for helping to address the financial challenges in your school? And again, as I said before, which of these are you particularly good at, and which of these do you perhaps need more help? It's very important that you have a moment to consider that. So which of these would you say are the most important skills that you need to help your school through the financial challenges, and which of these do you think you need most help in? Now, in total, we identified 16 skills which seem to enable heads to tackle the new challenges or the greater challenges of their role. And we asked 104 heads, as you know, to say which of these skills have become most important in recent years. So once again, we asked them to pick up to 7, and I'll just show you the results of that question now. Interestingly, most of the ones coming at the top are to do with leading the school as a business or as a legal entity that requires a strategy in a complex environment and a changing environment. So the main skills and the main knowledge areas or skill areas or skill requirements that heads are saying that have become most important in recent years are those relating to leading the school as a business. So here we've kind of grouped 1 or 2 of them together, but here are the 9 key skills that our research has identified as being needed more today than before. We're not saying that heads didn't need these skills before. As I said right at the beginning, we're focusing on what has changed the most in terms of the role of heads and the skills that they need. So these 4, as I said, are relating to leading the school as a business, strategic leadership, understanding the economics, politics, and society. That was one of the things that came up quite highly. Some people call that horizon scanning, sort of what's coming towards you. And then down in the bottom left there, a greater appreciation and understanding of the increasingly complex and higher stakes environment for decision making. And these are the 4 skills which heads are most likely to say have grown in importance. We also asked heads to rate their competence in these areas, and indeed the 7 others, the 16 skill areas. And remembering that this was an anonymous survey, we will assume that they were trying to be honest and accurate in their personal self-assessment. And the ones that came out as the 2 areas of greatest weakness or greatest lack of competence were the appreciation of new technology and also their own personal time management. I actually, on a personal level, perhaps find the page or 2 that we devote to time management in respect of heads one of the most interesting sections of our report. And on a very practical level, you might want to look at that. It's page 61 and 62 and 63, I think. But I'm just going to quote a couple of things from page 61. And we would actually encourage you, if you are a head, or indeed if you're in the leadership team of a school, to discuss this, because the only way that heads are going to be able to manage their time better, and they do have an awful lot to do, so it's very important that they do manage their time as well as possible. The only way they're going to manage that is with the support and collaboration of others. So in our report, we say that heads need to manage expectations. Children, staff, and perhaps particularly parents may be used to the head being involved in everything. And then we go on to say, although the concept of a hero head, someone who needs to be all things to all people, may not be an ideal to which the school heads themselves subscribe, the rest of the school community, including some governors, certainly still expect this. One head said, intellectually, everyone gets how the job of head has changed, but do people across the school community really want this? Or another one said, some parties, perhaps especially governing bodies, expect the hero head, someone who stamps around the school and everyone feels their presence. As I say, there are quite a few other interesting things to say about that topic in the report. I'm not going to go into all of these now, but all of them, as I say, will get further sort of airtime in the report itself. But just finally, on this topic of skills for now, we need to mention this. I did touch on it before, and this, if you like, is the 10th skill that we highlight. We need to mention this. It's described in different ways: building personal resilience, coping with emotional burden, working sustainably. But whatever you call it, the key point is that you may have all the financial acumen, all the business brain in the world. You may have wonderful abilities to delegate and empower your leadership team, and you may have all the excellent external facing skills of the greatest ambassador and salesperson. But unless you can work sustainably, you won't succeed as a head. And so this is therefore a fundamental element of leadership success today. And I think my colleagues think, and indeed my brother Barry, who researched and wrote this report, I should have mentioned him earlier. Sorry, Barry, and thank you for your amazing work. We've concluded that this is an area that hasn't been really given enough importance, and we'll come to that in terms of training in a moment. Here are a few of the comments that some of the heads said. Very little is ever done to support heads with the pressures of the job. How do you as a human being cope with all this? We get training on how to deal with a crisis, but what does it mean when you go home? And then this one, which is interesting. Learning to drive, I was told never to go below the red zone on the fuel indicator because there is a lot of sediment in the tank that you don't want in your system. I feel I am routinely using up the lowest quarter of the tank. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, the need for heads to be actors when in public, when inside they might be scared for their own jobs and the jobs of those they lead, creates huge pressure. I have found this incredibly challenging. And these are comments from experienced and, as far as we can tell, extremely successful heads. In our report, we do have a case study which is written by an experienced head teacher, in which he talks about how he looks after himself and ensures that he is able to work sustainably. And it's a really great and honest and insightful study, and I'd encourage you to read that. Of course, heads are much more likely to be able to cope with all this pressure if they get the support they need. So let's just look briefly, very briefly, I'm afraid, at some of the areas in which heads today might need more support. So in terms of governing body, we think they have a key role to reassure heads and improve and maintain their confidence. Obviously, one of the sort of the 5 key roles, I think, of governors, according to the Roundtree Foundation, is scrutiny. But the other is support. And we think it's very important, perhaps a little bit more important than some governing bodies realise, to provide reassurance and support for the heads and to work together and collaborate and work effectively with the head. Coaching. This was really interesting. I think we were actually slightly surprised at just how universal the praise was for coaching, and any sort of cynicism or skepticism that we came across was from heads who said that they used to be cynical but were no longer. In fact, I'm going to quote one now saying, "I would never have admitted 20 years ago." Sorry, I have now had, I'll quote it in full. "I have now had 3 different coaches over a decade, each one brilliant and completely helpful. I would never have admitted to that 20 years ago. And now I openly say that I seek advice and help from outside the organization." Another one says, "I honestly can't now imagine doing this job without a coach. and I think every single head should have one. It's what we refer to as a rare opportunity to be open and show some vulnerability. And in our report, we point to the many of the benefits of coaching. Some of the we provide some guidelines on how it can work best and be most effective. Um, so if you don't have a head, or if you're a governor and you're not sure if your head has a coach, sorry, I think I said head. If you don't have a head, if you don't have a coach, it's what I meant. Sorry. Then we would encourage you to explore that. And if you can always, there are lots and lots of coaches out there, but obviously, Love Your Coaching and Charlie Warshawski, our coaching partner, is certainly a very good one. Personal and peer networks, these are becoming increasingly widespread and important, I think, since the pandemic. And quite rightly, this is another opportunity for heads to be open and get relevant and realistic counsel and ideas. The skills mix. I think one of the key points from our research is that it's impossible for a head to do everything and to be knowledgeable about everything. And so heads more than ever before need to think of themselves as a key person in a network or a group or a team of decision makers and enactors. And we think that perhaps a really good way of thinking about leadership development, in fact, a slightly perhaps unusual way, is not to think about fixing deficits and filling gaps, but instead to think about getting complementary skills from others, whether it's the governors, the senior leadership team, or from external consultants. I should, sorry, just to make that last point clear. Training, as I said before, we think there needs to be a much greater focus in the training for headship on leading self, managing oneself, building one's own resilience, and sustaining one's own well-being, and indeed leading others. Those are the areas. They're not completely missing, but we do think they need to be given more emphasis. And there's often said that there are three different sort of areas of leadership development. Leadership development will often fall into one or more of these categories: leading self, leading others, and then leading the organization. And what we've done on this slide, which I'm not going to talk through particularly, but what we've put on this slide is all the different skills that we've identified in our research as being increasingly needed to be successful. So on the left-hand side, developing greater self-awareness. In the middle, developing the senior leadership team. And on the right-hand side, more fundamental or creative, bolder, strategic planning. The first two are really about self-awareness, personal effectiveness, and influencing others. And we think it's more in that area that training is required. So that's just a thought for you. So finally, for this webinar, and indeed the last part of our report, is to do with the assessment and appointment of heads. This is a very important area for us at RSAcademics. If you're watching this webinar, you may know that we advise on strategy, fundraising, marketing, various aspects of leadership like coaching, and also governance. We carry out reviews of governing bodies and provide support and training and advice for governance. But we also manage a lot of independent school headships in the UK, consistently over 50%, and quite often more than 60% of all the independent school positions that are handled by agencies. And we're constantly reviewing, constantly trying to improve and hone the way we approach that task. And this research has certainly enabled us to make some important changes to our approach, so that our clients can benefit, if you like, from the most sort of cutting edge and sort of latest thinking, and the most relevant and up-to-date thinking when it comes to the assessment of heads. So we're very pleased to have done this work and for our clients to be able to benefit from it. So obviously one of the big questions is, how do you assess the skills that have been highlighted as increasingly needed? How do you assess for them? Well, on the left, well, I've just put them all there, but obviously organized them into two categories, and the two categories we would suggest are on the left hand side, those that are harder to assess at interview. So if you look at conflict management or handling breadth and complexity, you know, that's a very difficult thing to assess at an interview. And on the right hand side, there are some things that are a little bit easier to assess at interviews. So, for example, right in the middle there, appreciation of legal requirements, regulatory changes, and so on. You can ask them a question about the changes in the regulations to test their understanding. So there are some things, as I say, that are harder to assess, and some things that are easier to assess. And it's sort of human nature that we overweight those things which we're able to assess, which is why things like being well prepared for an interview is often appreciated by interviewers, I should say. The ability to think on your feet, to be enthusiastic, the ability to build rapport quickly. These are things that are easy to assess at interview and also often get overweighted. Whereas the ability to build trust over the long term, as opposed to building rapport quickly, is very hard, if not impossible, to test at interview. So we've got some recommendations, which I'm going to just skip through now, but that we dwell on in a little bit more detail in our report, of course. And these are some recommended ways that you might want to think about assessing headship candidates. So the first is to use personality tests, sometimes called psychometric tests, but I understand from my brother Barry, that personality tests are just one type of psychometric test. But what personality tests do, if you administer them properly, is they legitimize an in-depth and highly personal discussion between interviewer and interviewee, between, say, the board and the candidate, about how the candidate likes to work and how they behave in different situations. And because of the test and the data and the narrative that is generated by these tests, it provides a language for that conversation. And so we would strongly recommend that this is used as an additional tool as part of the assessment process, because, as I say, it legitimizes or enables a much more in-depth and personal conversation. We're not the first people to say this at all, but we think there's a lot more could be done in this area, that boards should ask for examples of how candidates have done things. And why not tell them in advance the area that they're interested in? You know, if you're interested in how a head leads significant change, tell them in advance, we'd like you to think of some examples. So it's not about testing how quickly they can remember a good example. It's about the 20 to 30 minutes that you spend probing their answer. And it's the probing that reveals the way they make decisions and how they work with others. And in our report, we actually give a worked example of how you might do that. Real life exercises, chairing a discussion, for example, with real members of the senior leadership team or the governing body about a discussion about a topic which is live at the school. Because of the difficulty of assessing some of these important skills, like handling complexity and breadth, or organization and time management was one that was on the previous slide just here, organization and time management. Because of the difficulty of assessing some of these, it's very important that referees are interviewed extremely carefully. And we would suggest that you take as much time to prepare for an interview with a referee as you do for an interview with a candidate. And then this penultimate point, identify key strengths and consider fit with key requirements and how to fill gaps. What that's about is you start with a recognition that not every head is going to be good at everything. And the best candidates will be highly self-aware. They'll be able to identify the things that they're particularly good at. And then it's for you as an employer to work out, first of all, whether those are the things that you particularly need, and secondly, how you might fill those gaps, rather than choosing the candidates that covers most gaps, you know, reasonably well, which perhaps might be an alternative approach. And then finally, take your time, of course, don't rush it. So that is the end of this presentation. I'm going to stop the recording in a minute and go off to some meetings here in Dubai. But that's the end of this presentation about the new Art of Headship. Please, as I say, do download either the full report or the summary or indeed the wall poster, which is a bit of fun. And it has these 3 sections on the new challenges, the skills, and then the implications for the development and the recruitment of heads. And do get in touch, please, if you want to talk about anything that's contained in this research or inspired by this research, whether it's to do with your own career or if you're a governor, how to appoint a head, or if you just want to talk through some of the issues here. So from me, from my brother Barry, the author of the research, from everyone at RSAcademics, and from everyone at the Independent Schools Portal, I thank you for getting to this point. You've done well to get to the end, and I wish you all the very best in your schools. Thank you very much, and goodbye.